Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Not in My Neighborhood: How Bigotry Shaped a Great American City by Antero Pietila. Narrated by Andrés Pabon. Preface. Harlem on My Mind. This book examines how real estate discrimination toward African Americans and Jews shaped the cities of the United States in which we live. It covers a period from early suburbanization in the 1880s to the consequences of post-World War II white flight, ending in the first decade of the 21st century. The narrative centers on residential real estate practices in Baltimore, Maryland's largest city. But like the city it depicts, the story is all-American. The tools of discrimination were the same everywhere: restrictive covenants, redlining, blockbusting, predatory lending. A summer-long visit to New York in 1964 sparked my interest in these matters. It was my first encounter with the United States. I was a 20-year-old aspiring journalist from Finland, a country so homogeneous that eye and hair color marked the chief differences among its 4.5 million people. No blacks lived in Finland in those days, and only 1,500 Jews. New York's polyglot metropolis stunned me. While reporting one day in Harlem, I found myself naked and sweating in an old Finnish steam bath operated by an immigrant from Jamaica. It had been a popular gathering spot among residents of the Finnish community, which thrived in Harlem from the 1910s until the 1950s. Few traces of that population of several thousand survived. Rival socialist halls, including one with an indoor swimming pool and a bowling alley, were long gone, as were Finnish churches. One vestige still remaining was a hat shop on 125th Street, belonging to an elderly Finnish woman who had stayed after other whites ran. Another relic was the steam bath, with its black owner, a professional masseur, at Madison Avenue and 122nd Street. Harlem exemplifies succession, which is the sociologists' term for ethnic, racial, and economic change. In the space of 4 decades between the 1870s and 1910s, that section of New York City went from a white, upper-class community of American-born residents to one populated by recent Irish, Jewish, German, Italian, and Scandinavian immigrants. Soon thereafter, as a result of white abandonment, Harlem became African-American and Puerto Rican, as Gilbert Ossowski chronicled in his 1971 classic, Harlem, The Making of a Ghetto. Racial succession is not over either. Beginning in the late 1990s, Manhattan's overheated real estate market made Harlem's values so irresistible that whites began returning to live on some streets north of Central Park. Each transition is different, but one common dynamic is noteworthy: the make-or-break role of real estate agents. In her long, out-of-print 1969 work, Racial Policies and Practices of Real Estate Brokers, Rose Helper examined the prejudices of the National Association of Real Estate Boards, NAREB, and the discriminatory policies of the Federal Housing Administration, FHA. This book goes further. It also details the stratagems of blockbusters, freebooters who prospered outside the controls of local real estate boards. They sought out declining white neighborhoods near African American districts. They bought from panicked whites at rock-bottom prices and then resold to blacks at huge profits. Aging populations, the absence of normal ownership rotation due to the unavailability of financing, and a deteriorating housing stock hastened change. Unlike New York, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, Baltimore is not usually a prominent part of the American urban narrative. It should be. In 1910, the city enacted the first law in American history that prohibited blacks from moving to white residential blocks, and vice versa. When the U.S. Supreme Court, 7 years later, struck down such laws, Baltimore again became a model that other cities copied because private agreements had barred blacks and Jews from certain neighborhoods for years, until the Supreme Court in 1948 declared them unenforceable. Such restrictive covenants were the backbone of residential segregation throughout the nation. Baltimore was also a forerunner in blockbusting. Large-scale, panic-induced racial turnover began during World War II, earlier by about a decade than in many other cities. From the 1910s onward, neighborhood succession usually happened in the following order: non-Jewish to African American. The pattern was due to Baltimoreans' embedded aversion to Jews. Whenever Jews started to move in, neighborhoods emptied of non-Jews. If Jewish housing demand then also weakened, such areas became transitional zones, where sellers ultimately tapped the black market. The prejudice against Jews was so strong that while separate housing markets developed in many other American cities for whites and blacks, in Baltimore an additional market tier emerged to cater to Jews, who were prohibited by private agreements or custom from living in certain neighborhoods. The three-tiered market was so pronounced that even in the early 1970s, a separate multiple listing service sold suburban homes in areas open to Jews. Finally, in Baltimore, the experiences of an increasingly black city may be contrasted with overwhelmingly white Baltimore County, where the percentage of African Americans declined between 1950 and 1970, even though the county's overall population more than doubled from 270,273 to 621,077. This book documents how the county contained blacks through zoning and other government actions. During our period of examination, first Spiro T. Agnew and then Dale Anderson led the suburban county. Agnew, who later became Richard M. Nixon's disgraced vice president, continued long-standing policies that eradicated old black settlements. Anderson, for his part, in 1972, ordered that real estate agents must report to police any home sales they made to blacks. The narrative covers some 130 years of neighborhood transition, with an evolving storyline that establishes causal links. One such link connects to eugenics, a controversial international scientific, political, and moral ideology in vogue from the 1910s to the 1930s. This book shows how eugenics influenced the federal government's policies and actions. For example, the government redlined 239 cities according to white supremacist eugenic assumptions that ranked nationalities according to race, religion, and pseudo-scientific stereotypes. The eugenic mindset also guided the Federal Housing Administration's far-reaching policies until the 1960s. Several chapters deal with blockbusting, a hot-button issue after World War II when millions of whites fled America's city neighborhoods because they feared blacks. Victims of their own hysteria, they sold their homes below the market value to panic-peddling blockbusters, who then flipped them to blacks at extraordinary markups. The book reveals a previously overlooked initial motivation of blockbusting, transferring the astronomical modernization liabilities of substandard housing to unsuspecting black buyers. Previous authors have described blockbusting mostly from the viewpoint of fleeing whites, without any consideration of the black experience. With the addition of that prism, two diametrically opposite responses to blockbusting emerge. Whites saw blockbusters as enemies who enabled a black invasion. Blacks acknowledged blockbusters as profiteers, but also welcomed them as agents of liberating desegregation. This fundamental disagreement split Baltimore fair housing advocates. They were further weakened by mutual mistrust. Black leaders were suspicious of Jews. Jewish leaders did not trust blacks. Over the years, the term blockbuster has been used indiscriminately to tar everyone who participated in racial change, regardless of the circumstances or motives. Many true blockbusters were indeed villains, greedy and unscrupulous opportunists. But however reprehensible their tactics, they acted generally within the law after the Supreme Court moved toward legalizing residential desegregation in 1948. Blockbusters also were not a monolith. A central figure in this narrative is an African-American blockbuster who saw the breaking of white neighborhoods as his civil rights mission, similar to the restaurant sit-ins in which he was repeatedly arrested. The chapter about anti-Semitism describes a leading Christian real estate broker who excluded Jews from apartments he rented, neighborhoods he developed, swimming pools, and a golf course he owned. He had many counterparts in all corners of the country, but the same chapter also profiles one of the most powerful men in Baltimore's Jewish community, a celebrated builder, generous philanthropist, and untiring fundraiser for Israel, who nevertheless refused to sell or rent to fellow Jews. He was not the only one. Snapshots like these create nuanced pictures of complicated and often conflicted motives behind individual real estate practices. The totality produces an approximation of the hurdles that blacks and Jews had to overcome in their struggle for equal housing opportunities, not only in Baltimore, but in cities throughout the nation. Baltimore became my urban observatory in 1969, when I joined The Sun to write about neighborhoods, politics, and local government. The city was a sad and dispirited place, still reeling from the 1968 riots following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I witnessed its turnaround, for which it received All-America City Awards. Baltimore remained my beat for 35 years, interrupted by 8 years spent as a foreign correspondent in South Africa and the Soviet Union. The Queen City of the Patapsco Drainage Basin, as the Evening Sun columnist John Goodspeed called Baltimore, fascinated me more than the Kremlin. First as a reporter, and later as a member of the Sun's editorial board, I tried to share that fascination with readers. The setting for most of the narrative is West and Northwest Baltimore. That's where the trend-setting early cycles of ethnic and racial succession occurred, and future real estate patterns were established. Baltimore County is the focus of the post-World War II white flight for the same reason. It was the earliest, most common destination of whites abandoning the changing city. The active research and writing phase of this book took 7 years. When I started, Mark Rudder, a native Baltimorean, made a prediction: you will soon find out that Baltimore is a small town of closely kept secrets. This is a book about those secrets. Part 1. 1910 to 1944. A White Man's City. This government was made by white men, and shall be ruled by white men as long as the Republic lasts. Maryland's Democratic boss, Arthur P. Gorman, 1889. 1. 1910. The fate of a local sea captain, Peter Erickson, his 21-year-old daughter, and an 11-man crew agonized Baltimore on June 9, 1910. Their 3-mast bark, Good News, had sunk in a storm off the North Carolina coast 3 days earlier. Had they survived? All that was known was that the aging wooden ship occasionally carried dynamite to South America. Seafaring had been Baltimore's lifeline ever since 1729, when a small settlement of mariners, farmers, and iron smelters on the western rim of the Chesapeake Bay was named in honor of Cecilius Calvert, Lord Baltimore and proprietor of the Maryland colony. The town exploited its pivotal position at the border between North and South. In 1910, Washington, D.C., just 40 miles south, slumbered as the seat of the still puny federal government, but Baltimore thrived as a hive of trading and manufacturing. Its busy port was an entry point for foreign immigrants, second only to New York's Ellis Island. Its garment district and sweatshops knew few rivals. Railroading and steelmaking were big business. As that rainy Thursday wore on, Baltimoreans were relieved to learn that the missing sailors, their 2 dogs, and a cat, had been rescued, drenched and shivering, after spending 3 days in lifeboats. The Sun's interview with the captain's daughter, Elizabeth, made their ordeal sound almost lyrical. Of course, the waves were high and battered us around, but as long as the men said there was no danger, I didn't mind, she was quoted as saying. The nights were beautiful, and we had a grand view of Halley's Comet. We looked at it and talked about it. Riding over the waves at night has a certain pleasant sensation. A routine real estate deal that same day went unreported in the press and unnoticed by the public. Barely 2 miles uphill from the port, on the fringes of one of the city's best neighborhoods, Margaret G. Franklin Brewer sold 1834 McCullough Street to W. Ashby Hawkins. Constructed of red brick, the structure was like most residences in Baltimore then and now, a row house. While other cities built apartment houses, most Baltimoreans lived in row houses, always written as one word. Some attached row houses were grand, but most were not. The humblest were one-story structures only 9 feet wide. The house that Hawkins bought boasted 3 stories, but was only 13 feet wide. 3 weeks later, the Sun printed the sensational news that Hawkins was an African American. The city was under a Negro invasion, the newspaper's headline warned. By then, all of Baltimore was on edge. So was the nation. Just 2 days earlier, on the 4th of July, the flamboyant black boxer Jack Johnson had knocked out his white challenger James J. Jeffries in the 15th round of a World Heavyweight Championship fight in Reno, Nevada. Outraged whites rioted in several cities, and 11 people were killed nationwide. Baltimore escaped without fatalities, but 70 blacks, half of them women, were locked up in city jail. One Negro was badly cut by another, and 2 other Negroes were assaulted and severely injured by whites in arguments over the big fight, a newspaper reported. Hoping to curtail violence, Mayor J. Barry Mahul ordered theaters not to show a newsreel of Johnson's victory. The Sun, the city's newspaper of record, supported the ban. The fight film was contrary to public morals and a peril to the public peace, said an editorial in the morning paper. Race had become an intensively contentious issue in the United States in the half-century following the Civil War. First, the North imposed its will on the vanquished rebel states, requiring them to extend civil rights to African Americans freed from slavery. But in 1877, a political deal led to the withdrawal of federal troops, including large numbers of African American soldiers from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. With the occupiers gone, the revengeful old Confederacy ended Reconstruction. Democrats in state after state barred African Americans from voting and took other measures to deny their newly won rights. Racial segregation spread to a dozen northern states, where whites only and no blacks, or in some cases, no niggers allowed signs, appeared to enforce separation at shops, toilets, drinking fountains, restaurants, hospitals, and amusement parks. Popular culture promoted separateness. Among the Tin Pan Alley ditties that America sang at the time were "All Coons Look Alike to Me" and "Coon, Coon, Coon, I Wish My Color Would Fade." A revolutionary new medium, film, spread racial stereotypes. In 1896, the same year the Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson ruling established separate but equal as the law of the land, inventor Thomas Alva Edison released a novelty film, The Watermelon Eating Contest. It showed 2 blacks devouring watermelons and spitting seeds. Such other pictures as Sambo and Aunt Jemima and Nigger emphasized the inferiority of blacks. Thus many whites were scandalized in 1901 when President Theodore Roosevelt treated the educator Booker T. Washington as his social equal by inviting him to dine with his family at the White House, the first African American to be so honored. Among the more extreme reactions was that of South Carolina's populist Senator Benjamin R. Tillman, Pitchfork Ben, to his friends. "The action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that nigger will necessitate our killing of 1,000 niggers in the South before they will learn their place again," Tillman warned. Such a threat was real. Each year people were lynched for lesser offenses. Lynching gauged the change in race relations. Between 1882 and 1885, 481 whites and 227 blacks were lynched in various parts of the United States. Then a startling reversal occurred, and lynching became a weapon used chiefly against African Americans. From 1886 to 1935, 3,282 blacks were lynched against 903 whites. Overall, the position of blacks eroded so seriously that the historian Rayford W. Logan described the period after Reconstruction as the nadir of the Negro's status in American society. The actual low point began around 1890, when Northern Republicans ceased supporting Southern black rights and extended through 1940. McCullough Street in Baltimore became an emblem of worsening race relations. After purchasing the house from Margaret Brewer, W. Ashby Hawkins rented 1834 McCullough Street to his law partner, George W. F. McMechen, a Yale University Law School alumnus and the first graduate of Baltimore's Morgan College. "We did not move up there because we wished to force our way among the whites," McMechen told the New York Times. "Association with them in a social way would be just as distasteful to us as it would be to them. We merely desire to live in more commodious and comfortable quarters." Meanwhile, whites formed the McCullough Street Madison Avenue Protective Association. "The colored people should not be allowed to encroach on some of the best residential streets in the city and force white people to vacate their homes," the association resolved. Whites threw stones through the McMechen's door and windows, dumped tar on the front steps, and smashed bricks through skylights. Although there was no shortage of vandals, only 2 were caught. Arthur B. Rice and Irwin Scholl, both 9 years old, lived next door in the 1700 block. A juvenile court judge fined the boys $1 each. In its early history, Baltimore had expanded without much racial fuss. Main streets and alleys were racially, ethnically, and economically mixed. By 1835, however, whites had taken over the main streets. Blacks remained scattered throughout the city's 20 wards, but most of them lived in alley dwellings behind the whites' houses. After the Civil War, surging European immigration produced ethnic enclaves, many anchored by Roman Catholic parishes created for specific nationalities. Even so, borders between Germans, historically the largest immigrant group in Baltimore, and Bohemians generally shifted without discord, as did dividing lines among the Irish, Hungarians, Poles, and Lithuanians. Jews, too, participated in this ethnic recycling, replacing other whites, and sometimes blacks, in East Baltimore slums, only to be succeeded by a more recent immigrant group, Italians. The cause of this ethnic churn was suburbanization. Amid record immigration, suburbanization had gathered momentum throughout America, thanks to transportation provided by horse-drawn trolleys, and after 1890, electric streetcars. The revolutionary automobile shortened distances, freed motorists from pre-planned itineraries, and made previously faraway parcels attractive for year-round residents. Baltimore was particularly ripe for suburbanization. Plenty of land was available for development because large estates hugged the city. That additional space was desperately needed too. In just 3 decades between 1880 and 1910, Baltimore's population nearly doubled to 558,485 residents, of whom 88,065 were black. The population explosion exposed a scandalous civic dereliction. The nation's 7th largest city was the biggest without a sewer system. The low-lying areas of the city reeked. Outbreaks of typhus and yellow fever were common, even cholera. Experts had despaired over waste management and public health issues since the 1850s, but the ruling Democratic machine took no action. And there was a reason. Key leaders shared ownership in lucrative companies that monopolized the twin businesses of cleaning cesspools and processing wastes. They made money, and their money did not stink. A catastrophe jerked Baltimore into the 20th century. On February 7th, 1904, a freezing Sunday morning, a burning cigar ignited a 30-hour firestorm that incinerated 140 acres of downtown, destroying 1,526 buildings. Despite record low temperatures, it took a week for the ruins to cool after the fire was put out. No time was wasted in beginning reconstruction, including the planning and building, over 15 years, of a sewer system. Other long overdue concerns also were addressed, including the deepening of the port's vital navigation channel. The Great Fire opened the floodgates of suburbanization. Fearing that living close to downtown was dangerous, better-off families fled, moving to suburbs that were being created on land that the city had annexed from the county. Aside from everything else, moving made economic sense. As a result of a political deal, the property tax rate in the annex was barely 1/4 of what homeowners paid in the old city. No area was more affected by this redistribution of population than the Mount Royal district, which included McCullough Street. Although desirable because of high ground, old plantation lands had been too far away to attract developers until the early 1850s, when Henry Tiffany, a relative of the stained glass wizard, began building Utah Place. Baltimore had never seen anything like it. Evoking Europe, the neighborhood had a boulevard lined with shade trees and decorated with a flowering median, with pathways curving amid cast-iron fountains and marble monuments. Graceful homes lined the boulevard. After a mile, Utah Place dead-ended at Druid Hill Park, nearly as big as New York's Central Park. Reachable by streetcars, the park boasted a narrow-gauge railroad that transported visitors around, stopping at a Victorian boat lake and whimsical structures built in Moorish and Chinese styles. Period postcards showed another cherished tradition of Druid Hill Park, a flock of some 300 lambs under a shepherd. It kept the lawns from overgrowing. Utah Place connoted social status. Captains of commerce and industry built mansions there. After Johns Hopkins University was established nearby in 1876, President Daniel Coit Gilman moved to 1300 Utah Place. Dr. William Stewart Halsted, the father of American surgery, took residence at 1201. A PhD candidate of some promise, Woodrow Wilson, the future president, soon joined them, moving across the street. Lesser lights occupied McCullough and other side streets. Beginning in the 1880s, moguls of the German Jewish merchant and manufacturing classes began replacing those early notables. Mostly from Bavaria, they took on the trappings of aristocracy, much like the great Jewish families of 19th century New York. They built grand landmark temples along Utah Place, some with organs and mixed choirs of male and female singers. Christmas trees adorned magnificent homes. Exclusive private clubs sponsored sumptuous dinner galas and fancy debutante balls for Hebrew maidens, as one headline put it. That's why the self-selecting elite exhibited discomfort when soon after 1900 the scene changed once more. The most successful recent Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe broke out of East Baltimore slums and took over side streets near Druid Park Lake in an area that later became known as Reservoir Hill. Mostly Orthodox and soon outnumbering Utah Place's German Jews, they spread to neighborhoods around the park and also along North Avenue, a gateway to the city's northwest suburbs. The remaining predominantly non-Jewish area consisted of the southeast corner of Utah Place, below North Avenue, and later became known as Bolton Hill. A varied Christian population lived there in stately rows near handsome churches. Some residents were well-heeled old Baltimoreans. Others included a good-sized contingent of impoverished, erstwhile slave owners, rebel soldiers, and other unrepentant refugees from the South.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?